The topic of this video essay is masculinity in our time. And I think it's only fitting, in fact, to begin with the recent attempted suicide of former President Trump. We don't know that much about the man boy or man child whose last name is Crooks, but we can surmise that he was trying to prove his manhood in this particular way. Notice the picture of this particular boy who is perhaps not yet a man. He still looks very young, very childlike, very nerdy, a bit wimpy. And so we have every reason to believe that perhaps he was indeed trying to prove, for reasons we know not, that he was a real man. There are two more stories that are emerging there. Obviously, one is that former President Trump makes an iconic masculine gesture right after he got shot. And this has become, I think, a, a lightning rod of a symbol for those on the old right and perhaps also the new right. And then a more recent story would have it that the actual sniper who kills this young boy or man had a 1 in a million shot, it was said. Uh, and and he therefore is regarded as being quite a sharpshooter in his own right. So we have three stories in one, one about, as it were, failed manhood, another about an iconic symbol of male masculinity, and a third about sharpshooting, skillful, martial virtue, all in one. Now, I should say I'm recording this video on July 21st, and only a few hours ago, uh, current President Biden has announced in the form of a letter that he will not be continuing his campaign to be president starting in 2025. Many of the critiques of President Biden have pointed to his age and to his mental decline, in fact, to a certain loss of masculinity, to a certain frailty. In fact, I think this is a very nice way of framing the current political situation. Though it's not sufficient, it is at least one particular lens through which we can look at this specific election. And that is, it's a story about some kind of masculinity on one side and a certain feminization on the other. Uh, Masculine interest in bringing back a certain version of America centered on family and reasonable work and the like, and a softening of that picture on the part of progressive leftists, and therefore what some would regard as a certain feminine model of political life. The point in these essays is not to weigh in, but it is to begin to trace through intellectual history a story that may enable us to understand how we got here in the first place. These vignettes, I think, point me back to 1999 and to the pulp classic, or in any case, very interesting film, Fight Club. Now, Fight Club treats of a main character who is disillusioned with his bourgeois office drone life, and indeed with the good life, the goods life, rather, as I termed it, following Brett Gregory in another video that I'll point you to in the description below. So disenchanted or disillusioned, he starts a fight club that goes underground. It is one in which men can express their martial virtues and their sense of aggression with one another, and in so doing, beat each other into a pulp. So we have this rule-bound, underground club that's allowing men to express what Plato called their thumos, their spiritedness, these noble virtues of character. Obviously, that's not it because the film then treats that underground dojo as a training ground whose purpose becomes larger. That is the violent overthrow of corporate capitalism. So those two parts, the training and martial virtues, and the aim that I'm going to touch upon very soon. The current events, together with this movie that came out in 1999, I think point back to a rightfully important essay by William James, who was both a psychologist and a philosopher in his own right at Harvard back in the day. Let's turn to that essay, which is termed The Moral Equivalent of War. The year is significant. It's 1910 when he originally gives this talk. Why is 1910 significant? Well, we're only 4 years away from the Great War, what seemed to be the war to end all war, World War I, which stretches from 1914 to 1918 and brings to bear industrial warfare upon millions and millions of young men who will die through chemicals, through trenches, and the like. It is brutal, ghastly, bloody, horrifying. And that war is only 4 years away. If we look back, we also see that 1910 is just after the end of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. And Teddy Roosevelt was regarded not just as a New York City slicker, but also as a dude rancher, and above all, as a Rough Rider and later on a war hero. Remember that he fought in Cuba at the beginning of the Spanish-American War and was regarded as a, a, a powerful fighter and, in consequence, a great hero. His status only rose thereafter, and with the untimely death of McKinley, he ascends to the White House. So we should regard Teddy Roosevelt as a man who is from the East Coast, but who transforms himself into a Western-style hero, a rancher, a cowboy in a certain respect, a grizzly bear hunter, and then a war hero. And it came to an end in 1909. So now we're at 1910. There's one other significant part of this date, I think, and this is that I just finished a wonderful book, my wife and I did, in fact, by Brands, a historian, called Dreams of El Dorado. It's right here for you. Beautiful, epic, and perhaps above all, tragic history of the American West from around 1830 until 1909 or 1910. In fact, it coincides with a particular view according to which the Western frontier is no more. So if you think of the West as being a story about the settlement of this new frontier, then it is indeed settled more or less by the early part of the 20th century. And therein ends a certain story about what the West, the American West, was, at least in the cultural imagination, if not also in fact. So now we come to this essay, and it's going to be a way for me to try to tie together what James is arguing here with what Brands is illuminating through the various stories he tells in his book, Dreams of El Dorado. What is James pointing his finger on here? James is a pacifist. And remember, the title is The Moral Equivalent of War. And he thinks that his perhaps social utopian uh, buddies and friends and intellectual colleagues have missed an essential point about bellicosity or warfare. And this is that it's part of an honor ethos, a way in which men have traditionally transformed themselves through the cultivation of certain martial virtues, and in so doing have, in the Western sense, transcended their ordinary individuality for the sake of what James calls a collectivity, for the sake of some greater cause, such as the defense of a country. James sees that there's a problem, and the problem is that if you default to what I'll call the bourgeois ideal, it will be insufficient in that what Plato calls again, the thumos, the spirited, the ennobling part of the soul will not be able to seek proper expression. This then, if we only hew to the bourgeois ideal, more in a second, will enervate the human species, will dissolve certain vital energy that seems to often be expressed through, or perhaps mainly through, warfare, at least as far as history is concerned. Now, what is that bourgeois ideal? The bourgeois ideal is the goods life, as Brad Gregory put it. That is, coming to greater material well-being through commerce, work, and so on. A more recent version of this, and it's indicated actually in James's essay quite presciently so, is living longer, right? The longevity or anti-aging movement. So according to this ideal, which I don't think should be totally rejected, material prosperity is wedded to living a healthy and longer and comfortable life. We will find in Brand's long history that that is one part of the dream of the West. Many people, many men in particular, were searching to go from being wage laborers to being homesteaders, from being factory workers to being 49ers and striking it rich. There was indeed a dream of comfortable material prosperity on the other side of the country. But James sees that this is an insufficient ideal. That is, there would be decadence, as I said, an enervation, a sinking away of vital power without the martial virtues. And yet, he is a pacifist. And many of us would say in the 21st century that it's not entirely clear that war is often morally justified, uh, at least in a number of cases. This is not the point of this particular essay, but it does raise in us a fundamental concern about the need for war in order that boys could become men, in order that a part of the spirit could come to adventure, could come to solidarity, could come to glory, and could come to a certain kind of transcendence of my ordinary sense of self. So what is James going to argue for? His diagnosis, I would suggest, is correct. We do need a moral equivalent of war. For a look around you today and see how many young men are sinking in a quagmire of anime and listlessness, waywardness, neuroticism, and the like. Here, James fails. I think his solution is insufficient. He thinks that there could be a, a move from warfare being the arena to public works or industry being the comparable arena. In lieu of going to war, as Teddy Roosevelt really was rip-roaring to do, men will instead work in mines. He says this. They will be industrious. Or in lieu of fighting battles, and the battles are bloody with various Native American tribes back in the 19th century, young men will instead engage in public works. I trust you can see that this is a very unsatisfactory solution. If you grant that there's something in us that longs for something more expressive and vital, something that takes particularly men beyond their ordinary cares and concerns. It's just not entirely remotely clear that industry or public works is sufficient for that purpose. And that is actually what is playing out in Brand's book. We're actually going to see two motivations that I'll just touch upon here. The first, as I mentioned, is the ideal, the bourgeois ideal of material prosperity. And the second one actually is, especially among fur traders, buffalo hunters, certainly some subset of 49ers, those going to settle in Texas and the like, was an interest in adventure. Kit Carson, for good and for ill, was an adventurer, and he wasn't out for the profit motive. So there's something that he was looking for that he obviously discovered to some degree or other through his engagement with the American West, through the frontier. So now we can come back to our question, what is a substitute in our day for war? And I think we're grasping at straws. I don't think that James was right, but I'm not sure that we know what sense to make of it even today in 2024. What are our candidates? One of them, I would say, is exercise. Right? That is most specifically lifting weights or something like that. I trust you can see the problem with that view is that it's still highly self-interested. That is, there's not that collective dimension. It's not as though you're willing to lift weights and say, what am I willing to die for that is beyond my ordinary cares and concerns, beyond my sense of ordinary individuality. It's just lifting weights. So that's not really sufficient, just as Fight Club underground and on its own was insufficient until they came up with what could be a justified, or I would argue quite unjustified view of the use of violence. Another option is sports. But there are two problems with this. The first is that the telos, that for the sake of which sports are aiming, is still extremely trivial. Victory on the court on a particular day, however lovely it may be, isn't the same thing as the victory of, uh, of Xerxes in battle, right? The great conquest of a particular city-state in ancient Greece. So there has to be a higher aim to which, in this case, sport would be attached, and that's not really discernible. American football is tough, but in the final analysis, it's simply a game fought, as it were, during the course of a particular NFL season. So that too won't do. A third candidate, which is the one that is most attractive to people, takes this spirit of the fight and transforms it through entrepreneurship. So a fair number of startup people are interested in their hurly-burly of what it takes to get a startup to go from broke to the hockey stick growth curve and to an IPO or what have you. I trust you see that that one too may be insufficient for a whole host of reasons, but one, again, is that uh, the aim of producing another gadget or uh, another Airbnb is woefully insufficient when we think about that sense of transcending my ordinary sense of self. So I think we're left, what I'm trying to suggest is that in this video essay, we've come pretty far. And yet the questions, the existential predicaments, the fundamental puzzlements are not answered. And they are, to conclude, one, what is necessary in order for there to be material prosperity? That would be the bourgeois ideal. And yet there needs to be a cap on that question. Too much of it, and we get to a kind of dystopian Huxley-like novel Brave New World, in which we have the pleasure economy, in which certain forms of pleasures are readily available, and as a result, anything that is vital in us is sapped or zapped. The second question is, what is that spiritedness within us that can express itself in a manner that is justified, non-violent, and above the concerns of the ordinary individual? Now, in the past, I posited, back in 2016, I and a friend of mine posited that this could happen through a certain version of philosophy or philosophizing. More recently, I've thought that perhaps this can come through non-dual spirituality. I don't think those solutions are sufficient for our time. I don't think that they capture what it's like, for example, to be a young man who, like Matthew Crooks, is clearly lost and confused, without understanding fully, without a rite of passage, without genuine clarity, without a sense of something that is larger than himself. Uh, I'm not persuaded that what I've said there will be sufficient and will sufficiently meet someone like that. And therefore, at the end of this essay, I simply leave you with questions. Questions that I hope you will deeply, deeply consider.